Welcome, everybody. My name is Jay Guidemore. I'm the Director of Special Collections of the College of William and Mary in Virginia, and I'm also serving the Executive Board of the Manuscript Society. The Manuscript Society is an organization that encourages the collection and preservation of manuscripts and documents, stimulates and aids collectors in their various collecting specialties, and facilitates the exchange of information and knowledge among collectors, scholars, dealers, and the general public, archivists, librarians, and helps promote the highest professional ethical standards in collecting. It started off primarily in Canada and North America, but has become an international organization and it now has members in Asia, Australia, Europe, and South America, in addition to North America. The Manuscript Society publishes a quarterly journal called the Manuscripts and a quarterly newsletter called the Manuscript Society News. Also publishes books from time to time. We offer a scholarship program and assistance to collectors in Republican cases. And we also hold annual meetings, offering members a fun-filled get-together and visits to different manuscript venues in the United States. Some of the events have been in Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Washington, and Boston. If you're interested, in 2025, the annual meeting will be held in New York City, and there'll be some exciting repositories to visit. And October 25th, 26th, and 27th, 2024, the Manuscript Society will be tabling at the Baltimore Philatelic Society, the 86th annual stamp exhibition near the BWI Airport, the Marriott at BWI Airport. So if you're interested in learning more about the Manuscript Society and want to get an idea of what we do, there'll be some presentations and also some vendors there that will primarily focus on stamp collecting, but there'll be some other manuscript material there as well. We have an exciting talk here today. Tonight we have Lauren Goodley. She is a certified archivist and currently serves as the digital archivist at the Whitliff Collections at Texas State University in San Marcos, Texas. She earned her master's in science and information science from the University of Texas at Austin. And in addition to being a certified archivist, she also has a digital archive specialist certificate from the Society of American Archivists. She serves and presents at various local, regional, national, international organizations. And she works at the Whitliff Collections, at Collecting Literary Archives, where she does digital access and preservation for literary, music, and photography collections. She's going to be giving us some helpful tips on digital preservation, which is an area that is probably one of the primary concerns of archivists today, to make sure that 100, 200, 300 years from now, the digital files and digital materials that we're creating today are going to be preserved. So without further ado, the presentation has been recorded, but Lauren will be joining us afterwards to answer live question and answers. So without further ado, here is Lauren's presentation.
Thank you, Jay, and thank you, Lee, for setting this up. I appreciate y'all having me, and I'm happy to be here. Thanks to everyone for showing up on this Monday evening so we can get our week started off together. That sounds fun. I am going to talk about 6 steps of digital preservation. I love these steps. I think they're really useful. They are pretty general. So we'll talk about how to apply them specifically in our situations, but we will go over these 6 steps, and hopefully that will give you all some ideas about where to start for new digital preservation processes, or how to improve maybe some of your current processes. Some takeaways I'm hoping again will be to how to structure an inventory and some buildable metadata, and maybe a couple of actions that you could take right away, in addition to that inventory, which will be useful. So we're going to focus on decision points and organizational concepts. That is the plan. So my background is I work at the Whitliff Collections, and when it started in 1986, this was probably called a manuscript collection. I think of it as a collecting repository now. Bill Whitliff created the miniseries Lonesome Dove, and that was a smashing success. We have all of those production materials here. And he worked with a lot of people in this area and thought it was worth having an institutional repository for that material. So the Whitliff collection started with Southwestern writers. We have the papers of Cormac McCarthy, Sam Shepard, Larry McMurtry, who wrote Lonesome Dove. And some of our more recent acquisitions include Sandra Cisneros and Naomi Shihab Nye. We also collect fine art photography and photojournalism on the US Southwest and Mexico. And some of those photographers include Graciela Iturbide. We have some Edward Curtis prints and Mary Ellen Mark. We have recently moved into Texas music, so we have lots of material on Willie Nelson. We also have materials on Selena, Austin City Limits, and Stevie Ray Vaughan. So, and we should be moving into film soon, which maybe is not such a stretch to move into Texas music and into film, because the archives is always considered songwriting and screenwriting as writing. So we've collected on those areas since the beginning. And as you can see, we have a songbook that Willie Nelson wrote. I don't know, I think when he was 10 or 11, you can kind of tell there. Another item which has been digitized because everybody wants everything online, which is amazing, and also requires a lot of support, as you know. But we have Cabeza de Vaca's La Relacion, and this can be thought of as the first book about Texas. It is from 1555, I believe. So it's a little stodgy. The Spanish is pretty old fashioned. It also contains documentation about Native peoples and the land at that time, which is fairly unique. So it's a really strong resource for that history and knowledge. And it's a really nice, it was digitized really well. All of these are TIFFs. I created a coloring book out of the image on the left there. And the chapters have that little description. So when you go to the website, they did an exhibit, which was the reason they wanted it digitized, of course, was to put online. And so that website includes lots of information, some videos about the book and about that time period of what it means to put this book in context. So that's a pretty nice resource that I wanted to share. And you can zoom into the images on the website, play around with that. Yeah, so just to reiterate, we're going to go over 6 steps of digital preservation. I'm going to talk about a tiny bit of theory, and throughout we'll be thinking about making good decisions, having the information we need to do that. I'm going to avoid tools and platforms and technology. For the most part, there's time for questions at the end, and I'll certainly take those. I'm not an expert on everything, so we'll see where that goes. But for my presentation, I'm going to stay away from getting too much in the weeds about that. Anywho, yeah, the first thing to know about these 6 tips, and I changed it to tips here from steps because I just didn't want, these are meant to be helpful suggestions and things to think about and less of a really, 1 through 6 and then you're done. Like these should be iterative things that you can come back to. You don't feel like you have to complete each one before you move to the next one, that kind of thing. And what I like about these steps, I learned them at the Library of Congress in 2011, however many years ago that's been now. And they work really well. They still hold up. They're not super exciting. This might be a little bit of a boring conversation tonight, but what I like is that they're super scalable. So you could go through this process at a really large institution, or you could do it at a much smaller scale, and it will still work. So let's get into it. We're going to start with tip one, which is identify. And this is as simple as starting a list and creating an inventory. You might have an inventory that you can start with, but use one really with an eye for what digital materials do you have. And this is a chance to cast a pretty wide net. You want to make sure that you're considering everything so that you're not leaving out something huge like, I don't know, your email that might have lots of business documentation in it. So you can think about what materials you have as far as content, maybe also agreements. I'm not sure what your business records look like, but that might be something to consider including. When you're trying to make this inventory, you can also think about where materials are. So different hard drives, home or office computer. Um, that can be another way just to make sure that you're not, there isn't something hanging. So you start your list. It can be anything. It can be a piece of paper. It can be a Word document. And you start to add some description. What do you need to know about these items in order to maintain them and in order to provide access? So this is usually the part of the presentation where I ask people to holler things out. So I'll do my best to holler for you. The first things we usually hear or think about would be title, date, and description. So you need to know what the file is in order to manage it and maintain it. So some really basic, it doesn't have to be super in depth, but some pretty basic description. So you know what it is that you're talking about and that you're working on managing. And then as you go and you start to fill out this inventory, at some point you might want to switch to an Excel. And again, this could be pretty simple. It could be a bigger database if that's more your style. And we can start thinking about some other important information to move forward with digital preservation. One would be a unique ID. Sometimes that can be, you might have like an accession register that covers this. It could be a file name, but definitely to give something a unique identifier. A collection or project name would work as well. You definitely want to know the location of the files, where you can find them, um, a file path or a hard drive, that type of thing. Rights information is something really good to think about pretty early on. That is something that's going to follow the file. So as soon as you can get that, and I guess I'll stop for just a moment and remind us all that this is iterative. So these are ideas to get you started. This is not meant to be something that has to be complete before you do anything. This is a way in, a starting point in this sort of planning. So rights information, and then as you work with the materials, you might discover things like file type and file size that will be useful later on. So starting to build that out. And now that you have a list of materials, you want to do some selection. Tip two is select. The key theme here is to make your digital preservation actions opt in. You want to be thoughtful about your digital preservation actions. So this is where you can develop some criteria. You can maybe prioritize 1 through 3, something like that, whatever makes sense to your brain. Maybe you want to mess around with some low hanging fruit, maybe, something small or something easy. Maybe you want to tackle a really important item that's, keeping you up at night and you want to make sure that it's managed well. You might also want to think about size here. Make sure it's something that you feel comfortable managing files. And whatever criteria you come up with, you can add to the inventory. Whether you prioritize something, whether you say on this date is when I started working on this collection. So selection, you definitely don't have to do everything all at once. Just start with something. The next tip is to remind us to do management throughout. And so when I think about the manage step, I think about managing the materials. It is good to develop a system for that if you haven't already. And I don't mean to, throughout this presentation, I don't mean to say that you haven't done any digital preservation work. I feel sure that everyone has done this to some degree. Here, I'm trying to sort of talk about some basics and surface them a little bit so that we can talk about them and improve processes. So either develop a system or look at the system you have. Like, is it making sense? Are your file folders and file system making sense? Do you know where all your metadata files are? And is is that system making sense? Like, it's good to take stock. And if you've grown at all, make sure that's still working for you, that you're managing the materials in a way that works well for you. And then another thing to think about here is managing the digital preservation program. In the resources at the end, there is a link to how to develop a digital preservation policy, which again might be kind of overkill for maybe a small collector. I don't want to say small, for a single collector or a smaller shop. But there's also some good tips in there, and you can Google and find other people's preservation policies and sort of copy those. But this will give you some good language for communicating with, I don't know, maybe new donors or people that you want to have relationships with. You can show them that you have a policy and that their materials will be handled well once you have them. That will also give you language for communicating with resource allocators, whether that's granting institutions or I don't know what that will look like for you, but this is where you can get some language to show your commitment to digital preservation and the work that you're doing behind the scenes. So manage the materials and then think about managing your program and what kind of documentation that would look like, with an eye to maybe a short digital preservation policy. I want to make sure and talk about storage a little bit. There are a couple of places to look for guidance on storage. This is something which changes a lot. One thing that hasn't changed is this theory of locks, which is lots of copies keep stuff safe. You cannot go wrong with that. It recommends 3 copies in disparate geographical, administrative, and technological locations. So, um, basically saying not 2 identical hard drives purchased on the same day sitting on your desk. That doesn't really count as separate copies. They need to be separate in these different ways. And the way people do that is either by working with partners in a group like this. You have lots of colleagues in the room now, and sharing that storage, keeping somebody's materials while they keep yours, or a consortia that manages that for you. And Locks does, one of the things that they produced besides this theory was software to manage that. So if you have a couple of partners, you can go to Locks and say, we would like to implement the Locks system, and they will help you organize that and do health checks on your materials. So putting that out there as some options. The other options for storage include a vendor. We talk about Amazon being a black box. It is super useful. There are some really inexpensive options for Amazon, especially if you're really talking about long-term storage and you're not going to pull down items often. That can be very accessible. We just don't know what's happening. We sort of just have to trust Amazon when they say, yes, your files are good. We run health checks regularly. There has been no problem. We sort of have to have some trust there. So the other one other option is that academia has come up with a more transparent option, and using open source tools and lots of documentation, and um, that is Chronopolis, which has different nodes. A little more expensive, but something to look into. If you're going to do storage in-house, that means you'll be taking on all the maintenance. And so that, you know, again, might depend on how much material you have, the size. If that's something that you can handle and you feel comfortable with, then yeah, doing your storage, maybe not on site is not what I mean by in-house, but managing the storage yourself is also an option. And of course, we will follow our manage step and document everything that we do here so we can keep track of that, and maybe change course along the way if things change for us. Moving on, the next tip is protect. And there's a couple of ways to think about this step as well. Sort of the general lock doors, file permissions, passwords on your materials, that kind of protect from bad actors. There's also, I'm sorry, I was also thinking about fire, those kinds of protections to do for digital materials the same way that you would do for non-digital materials. The other thing about protect is that this reminds us that there is this thing called metadata that can be super useful and provide us with a way to manage our materials. So it's generally called preservation metadata, and these are the things that are generally covered. So however this makes sense for you, it can be in that really long Excel that we just keep building out. But you want to make sure that there's reference information for each file, which we've talked about. Provenance is a big one that I'm sure y'all are familiar with, and we want to, as I am in archives, and we want to make sure that that information is captured. We want to make sure there's some context or description. The thinking here is that if this file were found in the wild, we would know what it was. But more importantly, it will allow you to make decisions. And when it's in your wild, when it's in your hands, you'll know what it is, what to do with it quickly without opening the file. And so context description, fixity and checksum. This goes back a little bit to the storage where, depending on what storage you use, this can be outsourced a little bit. But you should have a copy of everything locally. No matter how you do your storage, if you use Preservica or sort of a all-in-one option like that, you should have a local copy, and running fixity checks is a good idea. Checking your checksums and making sure that there hasn't been any bit rot or any funny business that way. And then keeping that access and rights information. That's considered preservation metadata, how to handle these materials in the future when they're used. And wrapping up number 6, all of this has been building to provide to the point of preservation is access into the future. So sort of looking back at the other steps, we've tried to build in everything so that when you are ready to provide access, these tips will have given us all the information that we need, that we have the descriptive metadata, that we have the preservation metadata, that we have the rights information, we have the location, we can find it quickly when somebody needs it. All of that information, the purpose is to provide access into the future. I'll just note here also that when we talk about standards like file types, and we want them to be open or standardized, that's a decision that's made pretty early in the process to use TIFF or JPEG, to use PDF where you can. That the thinking is always to provide. So once you get to this point, that you will have what you need for that. So that was a pretty quick and dirty overview. I wanted to just do a tiny bit more of your time and talk about theory a little bit. I think it's important. But also, I hope we'll see that we've already covered a lot of this. And another reason why I'm a pretty big fan of these six tips or steps. So OAIS stands for Open Archival Information System. It is a reference model and an ISO standard. Um, so one thing that I think is really good to take away from it is the vocabulary. Um, it is very non-library oriented, which is good and bad, but it generally the vocabulary allows us to talk to um, people outside of our field. So I'll just go through that quickly, that they use producer for what we might say is creator or donor, and then consumer, we might say user or patron. Um, Management is something that we've talked about a lot today. So I mean, you could check that off your list that you understand the management aspect of OAIS. Um, for maybe upload or copying, they use the word ingest to ingest material into the archive. We've talked about storage, we've talked about data management, access, and they really surface administration and preservation planning in this model, again, which I think is useful to make sure that that's on everybody's radar as we're doing this work. And then the really tricky ones, which are just such jargon, is the SIP, APE, and DIP, that there's a submission information package, an archival information package, which is normally what we would think of as the preservation files, and then dissemination information package. And the distinction here is that they may be different files. You might use a TIFF for preservation and a JPEG to provide access. You might have gotten that in some kind of camera format, and then copied that into a TIFF for long-term storage. So those files might be different. And the package refers to that there's files and then there's the metadata, and both of those things are necessary to for an archival package in this system. Um, so the metadata, again, would be different for these three purposes, that you might expand upon what you get from the producer at the point of submission, and that you might not disseminate everything to whatever user that you're working with. Yeah, so that's a good thing to know about, that exists and is a tool to kind of guide us. Um, I talked about locks a little bit. Lots of copies keep stuff safe. Just some background there is that this system and theory was developed at Princeton in 1999. So it's been around for a minute. And they were concerned about journal articles that were being held by the journals or by Elsevier, and making sure that there were plenty of copies of those and that they would be available. So they came up with the three copies. And I thought it was interesting that the thought there is that if you have two where the checksums don't agree, then you have a third to kind of break that tie, and you know which one is correct. So that's the thinking behind the three copies. Um, and they also came up with the concept of partners or nodes, that's an efficient way to create those multiple copies. Another thing I couldn't let myself get away with not talking about is the three-legged stool. It is really easy and often how people start digital preservation, which is fine, which is jumping into some technology, doing some things with files, making some copies, storing them places, and making sure that you have the resources to do that. So these six steps, OAIS, even locks, are thinking about the organization, thinking about you as a manager. What are you doing? How are you making these decisions? What sort of thought processes do you need? And sort of focusing on that organization. The digital preservation plan would be part of the organization um, leg of this three-legged stool. And good practice is something I think that can be useful to think about, that good practice is enough, that we don't need to be perfect at everything or anything in order to do good digital preservation, that it is not right-sized, that everyone will have a different solution. There are multiple good solutions. Then it might be a little messy. That's okay. Not everything is we're used to that in archives maybe. And that good practice is dynamic and flexible, that you will be ready for changes and able to make changes as maybe technology changes, for example. So getting back to the 6 tips, I wanted to make sure I didn't get away from that. It was identify, select, manage, store, protect, and provide. Um, Starting with that inventory. And yeah, these are the resources. So the three-legged stool is part of a larger digital preservation management workshop. That website has so much information, and it is well established and also kept up to date. So I highly recommend. The OAIS cheat sheet is excellent. Brian Lavoie captured sort of a 200-page pink report and made it just a couple of pages, which is really useful. Locks has information about both sort of the system and then how to become a partner with them. And lastly, I didn't talk too much about this, but the National Digital Stewardship Alliance developed these levels of digital preservation, and that can be a useful tool. There are lots of ideas there on actions to take. What I like about it so much is the levels, that not everything needs to be treated the same. Kind of looking back at when we were originally talking about opting in and developing criteria, maybe not everything needs the highest level of preservation actions. And maybe some things could just use a little bit of attention, and that's also appropriate according to the NDSA. And yeah, thanks for hanging in there. For everyone still on the line, I enjoyed my time. And I think we have time for questions.
Thank you very much, Lauren. That was wonderful. Really great summary of the digital preservation issues we've been dealing with. There are some questions. Let's start with, if you have any questions, please put it in the chat or the Q&A section. The first question is, let me see here, is should born digital materials be treated any differently than digitized materials?
Thanks. Yeah, I think there's a couple ways to think about this. I'm assuming that a lot of us have, at this point, both born digital and digitized files. Born digital meaning that they're not digitized; they were a Word document or a digital camera file. And the 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 official word, the theory is that once it's digital, everything gets treated the same. That the 3 copies, that the the inventory and the selection, that the levels of digital preservation, all of that applies to materials, no matter how they came to be digital. In reality, there are some differences, especially in metadata. In file formats, if something is digitized, you have more control over, you've probably gotten to choose the file format. Um, and and then the metadata will be different for those 2 different types. So the short answer is no, they should be treated the same as far as digital preservation, but the nuance is that once you dig into it, there will be some differences. So I think this all applies. It just will sort of shake out differently for the 2 types of materials.
Another question is, you mentioned TIFF files versus JPEG, and that TIFF files are better than JPEG, but are PDFs better than TIFF?
Um, I mean, better, generally, let me think. If you're there, I'm kind of feeling like there's an apples and oranges situation here. So please correct me if I'm misunderstanding. But um, TIFF and JPEG are generally for images. So, for example, if you're digitizing something, you would probably digitize as a TIFF and maybe try to capture a really high quality file. Those are larger. They just have more zeros and ones, more pixels to get a high res is a word that would be used with TIFF. And then the JPEG is something that you would maybe compress down to and provide access to either online or some other way. But everything's changing, and the JPEG 2000s are actually really, really good. And so, it depends on your situation, but generally, that's usually how we think about it: is that TIFF is um, would be like a preservation standard. And I will say standard because I think I mentioned briefly that anything that is open, sorry, that's not proprietary, is better for digital preservation. So TIFF and JPEG both fall into that. PDF, I usually think of for, I mean, I guess technically it is an image file. It's usually used for textual documents. So I'm getting confused. I have never, I'm trying to think if I've ever really come across an image, a JPEG that was saved as a PDF. And I guess you could do that. But I generally think of PDFs as being a way to that we want to stay away from Word document, PowerPoint, anything that is proprietary and that we can't get our hands on. Um, so um, yeah, so so generally you want to migrate those files into a better file format. PDF is kind of weird because it's owned by Acrobat. Acrobat's been kind of, or Adobe, and Adobe's been kind of nice about making the PDF code available so that it's becoming more of a standard and more open. So I don't know if that was helpful at all.
A good comment was made on the chat was that a TIFF file will not deteriorate as fast as a JPEG, and that PDF files are never as large as a TIFF file, and that sometimes can be an issue.
Yeah, for sure. The JPEG would be smaller than a TIFF, which it would be generally why they would be much better for access. But then for long-term storage, you might want that bigger file. Um, and then, yeah, thanks, Brad. Great.
And what are your thoughts on printing digital files for preservation?
I mean, you know, I would not be against it. It feels like maybe smart sometimes. If I can't think of an example, maybe you have one and that's what you were thinking of, but I kind of trust everyone in the room. If in your particular situation you have some documents that are pretty important, paper is going to last for, I don't know, y'all tell me how many hundreds of years. Maybe it does make sense to print those documents that are super useful. Um, oh, thanks, Mark. Yeah, I didn't have my story straight on that, but I was close. Um, yeah, so, yeah, I would trust you on that one. I don't think I mean, it gets a little unwieldy, I think, is the thing. Like, the nice thing about digital is that you can be like, here's a thumb drive with the last 5 years of, whatever. You can put a lot into it. So it might, as long as you're able to manage it in that way and, provide access and organize those printed out documents, and it's not, you're not going through reams of paper. Yeah, I think that would be a good solution in certain ways.
Now, with regards to some process and procedure, does anyone have the question, am I doing this right? Or is there another way to do this thing?
Yeah, I appreciate that, Colby. That is a good point. That if you are going to do sort of thinking about long-term preservation or like a backup on paper to make sure that your ink and paper, that you've sort of done your due diligence there. We don't want any faxing situations, fax paper situations or that heat. Um, y'all are chatty. I like it. I'm trying to keep up. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, Brad. There might be, like you said, certain situations where it's just super convenient. And so, yeah, why not? Why not do the printing something?
Lauren, I have a question regarding the literary archives that you're creating.
Mm-hmm.
Because obviously a lot of authors and writers now are creating materials directly into different file formats, so the literary rough drafts, the literary manuscripts, you don't have the cross throughs and the marginalia and so forth and some of the rough drafts that we get with some of the earlier writers. So what role, when you're trying to collect writers' archives, what role does the creator play, or what kind of contact do you have the creator to encourage them to preserve the creative process? How one draft changes from another, and rather, because when I write, I'm not an author or a writer, so I just, next morning I just start over with a range document. So I don't have draft one, two, and three.
Yeah.
You encourage authors to do that kind of thing.
I mean, I'm not really in a position to do that, so no, I haven't. What I have seen is that, um, like anything, it depends on the creator, and some do keep different drafts because they know their work and they know they're gonna, if they, excuse me, if they do delete within a Word document, they don't want to, they will want to keep that older version that they can go back to for whatever reason. So I've seen collections come in that do have those different versions. Um, a lot of people are still using paper, so we still collect a lot of paper. Um, and the other thing that's jumping to mind is that I think I mentioned we have the materials of Naomi Shihab Nye, who is a Palestinian American poet in San Antonio, who lives in San Antonio, and um, she there's actually a lot of faxes in her material, but there were emails later in her time, and she and her editor were sending things back and forth to each other. So there ends up being a quote paper trail more than I think that we're worried about. Like sometimes I think that our processes aren't all that different in digital. Like we don't always delete and throw away things. Sometimes we save them and using the royal we here. So
Okay.
I'm gonna. I've just popped into the. Oh, go
Q.
ahead, Jay. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just saying there's some in the Q&A.
Yeah, I was taking a look at that too. Um, anonymouses. Yeah, just like one book. Oh, that's a really good question. I don't know. I've seen, I know there's lots of things published out there. I don't know that there is, um, a one book. I can recommend, Jay mentioned that I have a digital archives specialist certificate from SAA. And even if you don't want to go through the whole program to get the certificate, their classes are very good and have gotten better since the program began, frankly. So they're really good at giving this overview. We're well enough into the field that there are some tried and true, things that aren't going to change. And anyways, I would just recommend that again, either going all the way through or sort of picking and choosing the basics classes or the things that you're interested in. And they do access as and arrangement description and all different as well as preservation. Um, yeah, there's I don't know about a book. I'm gonna keep thinking it's gonna bother me tonight. But There's also a group called Library Juice, and they had a few webinar tutorial type things as well. I'll keep thinking about that. And then my 3 little resources. Those are not they're helpful websites. They're meant to be instructional. I think I can recommend those as well. The first group, the Society of American Archivists, Mark, if that was your question, has a program called Digital Archive Specialist from SAA.
There's the question about MPLP, more process, less, or more product, less process regarding digital files.
I mean, well, I would be curious. Now you have me real curious about what your born digital material collections look like. I mean, the arrangement and description is important for digital and born digital, as you know. So those can be described in groups the way that archives are. So, putting all the correspondence or everything about one work together. I feel like MPLP, wow, I feel like MPLP can work really well for digital. Um, Partially because it's easier to control F through things and sort of muddle through and find things to search. Um, so I guess I'm so sorry. I guess I don't really have a recommendation. And I might just refer you back to, I know that the Society of American Archivists does have like a 2-day arrangement and description of digital archives course that I have not taken, and it sounds amazing. And um, you should report back to us if you take that, what you learn.
Any more questions? Okay, well, thank you very much, Lauren. Really appreciated your time here tonight. One more thing about the Manuscript Society. On November 4th, Stuart Lutz will be talking. He is an appraiser and dealer, manuscript dealer, and he's going to be talking about his collecting of Vietnam War materials. So please join us on November 4th. There'll be additional material coming up in the next few weeks. And I hope everybody has a great evening, and thank you very much, Lauren.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks everyone for having me, and thanks for your thank yous in the chat. If you're welcome to reach out to me if you want to continue talking. I love talking about this stuff. But yeah, I appreciate y'all.